Hi everyone, I'm Max, the co-founder of Techruiter, and welcome to the very first episode of Techruiter Talks. Today I'm really excited about kicking off this series by welcoming our good friend, one of the best engineering leaders I know, and the current VP of Engineering at ZOE, Julien. ZOE is a biotech startup who've grown from strength to strength over the past few years. And today we're going to be talking about Julien's journey, his approach to scaling teams, and building high-performing distributed teams across the globe. Welcome, Julien.
Hey, Max, it's great to be here. You were very, very nice with me. I don't deserve all of that.
It's amazing to have you here, Julien. I suppose by way of introduction, I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I started in software engineering 15 years ago, something like that. Like everybody in my position, I started as an individual contributor. I actually started by funding a company when I was studying. Like it never got big or anything. It was just me and two other people, but it learned me a lot. And after that, I spent many years in finance, quantitative trading. I worked for 3 different firms in that area. And I also worked for a company called Criteo, which was more ad tech, and basically went from individual contributor to knowing a bit more, being a bit more senior, to switching to leadership when I joined Criteo, and that was 7-8 years ago, something like that, to occupying an engineering manager position and having more and more people report to me. And 2 years ago, I joined ZOE as VP of Engineering after a lot of introspections on what I wanted to do, what kind of company I wanted to work for, and also what was the best place for me to influence culture, which led me to join a startup, very early stage, to be able to steer the ship in different directions and experiment with different ways of working.
Wonderful. Having worked in ad tech, then moving into the hedge fund space, and now for the first time in probably the last decade to go to a direct-to-consumer product. How has that experience been for you over the last few years in comparison to working in the other domains?
So the first thing is that I was looking for that. That was not like my top priority to join a B2C business, but that was still quite high on my list. And I was looking forward to work on something where you can feel the impact that you have on other people, and I found it a lot more tangible when you're talking about people. When you can show to your wife what the product would look like, that when you're building software for other companies, and obviously it's also very different from building internal software, because internal software, it's very easy to talk to your customers, right? You can just, if you have an office, you can just go to their desk and spend 3 hours, figuring out what on earth they're doing. So you've got those very, very fast feedback loop. When you've got customers, when you're B2C, the goal is still to have this very, very fast feedback loop, but it's harder. I cannot just go and sit next to someone, especially not me. Like we do a lot of user interviews, but you have to schedule that, and it's you have to be very respectful of people's time. So it's kind of a different environment. It can be both harder in some ways and easier in others. Harder because you've got maybe less access to the information, and you're not necessarily talking about to experts. But you can have a lot more data because you may have a lot more customers, so you can be more quantitative. So it's a different world and exciting world for sure to be in.
Who do you think is the hardest stakeholder to please in those environments, right? If the services you're building, for instance, is it the consumer that interacts with the app? Is it the engineer? You mentioned the feedback loops being very different, but in a way, who's harder to please in those environments, would you say?
Well, I think in many ways, pleasing a mass market is a lot harder than just if you're building internal software, because when you've got, when you're building software for example, a team of quantitative trader, you have a team of quantitative trader in front of you. Like there might be more than one, there may be 5, there may be 10, but it's very finite, right? You can talk to all of them. You can really understand what they want, and you can have this feedback loop where they say, hey, let's build X, and like, oh, I don't think X is that good. Why don't we build Y? But it can go very, very fast, this conversation. Whereas when you're talking about mass market, you're going to have a lot more noise. You can have a lot more people saying totally contradictory things. And it's going to be very difficult for you to know with any amount of certainty what you should do. So in an ideal world, you start doing A/B test, and then you let the data speak for itself. And we do some of that, not everywhere, because it does require scale to have very significant results. So it's going to be a lot more objective, but it's also taking more time. It's just harder to set up. You need to roll out those things to a lot more people to get that data. So it's just two very, very different scenarios, I feel.
So this segues us really nicely into something I wanted to discuss, which is you went from running quite a large team, 30 to 60 people in data processing and data research. You went into ZOE, a product company, B2C, inherited a much smaller team. What were those first few months like? What was that shift and transition, given it's something you wanted to experience and you wanted to go into? What did you find? What was pleasantly surprising, or what confirmed some of the thoughts you might have around the challenges? Walk me through those first couple of months.
So the first part is that I don't have a great memory. So it's almost 2 years ago now, and I'm sure I don't remember all of it. But certainly my role kind of drastically changed from almost one day to another. Where I was before at your research, I reached a point where whether I was there or not there, didn't make any significant difference to the performance of the teams that were reporting to me. I think we had done most of the journey. We could still improve in plenty of ways, but we were in a reasonably good place. When I joined ZOE, as you said, very small team versus your research. I think when I joined, there was probably 7 software engineers and maybe 8 with me. So, you go from being a manager of managers to, being just a manager or even like a team lead. And the first part is just, trying to contribute in whatever way you can. So, working a bit on the organization, but at that scale, you want also to understand, to write some code and understand what on earth is happening at the technical level, because it is too small to just say, oh, I'm the people manager. I'm only think about organizational design, and nothing else. So I think, a lot of the challenge when I arrived was, taking a bunch of people that tending to work quite a bit in isolations on different topics and try to rebuild a team from that. And I think that's working for a startup, at least a startup like ZOE, because at the point where I joined ZOE, the company was almost 2 years old. So it's been there for some amount of time, but basically doing R&D. But the challenge was really, you have a lot to do, a lot of different streams happening, such as how do you support a medical study, but how do you at the same time build the product you're going to sell. So how do you get all those people who are a bit silos to work a bit more together, a bit more in the same thing, in a context where you're extremely constrained in terms of just capacity. It's true everywhere in software engineering. You always have a lot more to do that you can. The demand will always adapt to the supply. Even if you are 10 more engineers, you'll have more demand. I always leave that. But in a startup world, that is even more true, with different kind of time frame in the sense, in a company that is established, if you go a bit slower at the beginning to go faster at the end, it's not going to kill the company. In the startup, it could. You have those immediate things you need to achieve to get the next round of funding, to get the data you need to build your product, and get some confidence that you don't need to pivot. So you need to constantly trade off those things. And that's very hard. I think that's certainly has been my experience, and something that was really new when I joined ZOE, this kind of different time horizon.
There's so many things you touched on there, and it'll probably take us several hours to go through and unpack each one of them. But the biggest thing you mentioned, and I think it's kind of the overarching theme of, if you inherit something where there are capacity issues which prevent you from meeting certain product milestones, or people are insulated or siloed off working on certain projects, and your role is to come in, break up these silos, increase capacity, and make sure all the product milestones are hit, right? So that was the challenge you had. What was your approach to actually fixing it? So when you got on the ground and you have your team who are insulated in these pockets, who might not have this overarching kind of sense of togetherness or purpose running through how we build, why we build, and what timeframes we build, and you're extremely under-resourced, how did you begin tackling that, and in what order?
So, the theory is easy. Putting it in practice is hard, and certainly we had our fair share of challenges. But if you want to decrease silos, you need to manage a work in progress better. You need to do less things with more people. This is the only way you break those silos, because if you've got 10 software engineers and you've got 10 different topics, then there's just no way anyone's going to work with anyone else if those 10 topics just run in parallel. Everybody will be super focused on one thing. It just will never have the time to work with others. So the theory, super easy, do less things in parallel. The practice is obviously a challenge, because now that means, hey, you want those 10 things business. Which one do you put on hold? And suddenly everything is important. So it becomes, how do you prioritize those things? Or how do you decide to invest a lot less time on one thing versus the other? So I think we tried to do that. Succeeded in some places, did not in others. And then we've also decided to do kind of a few radical things, or at least I thought they were somewhat radical. For example, at the time I joined, we were building mobile apps for product, both on Android and iOS. We decided to kill Android entirely, and we asked our Android software engineer to move to iOS. So again, removing the silos. And the main reason why was, by having both Android and iOS, we're not learning twice as fast, because we're implementing exactly the same thing on two platforms. So actually we're creating work for ourselves, because now you have to make sure that the two are more or less aligned, which obviously is going to be challenging. Is one of your software engineers go for holiday for 2 weeks, you're going to always create this disparity. So we had these challenges of basically not learning a ton more, but basically spending twice the amount of time. So that's one of the things we decided, let's just kill Android. It was a hard decision. Like, it's very obvious in retrospect, but when you're new to the job and you're like, dear Kenneth is our Android software engineer, I know you love Android, this is your platform, what about you become an iOS software engineer? This is not an easy conversation at the beginning. And he was actually very supportive, because he really understood the why. But still, that's most people would think about their career and it doesn't make any sense for me. I've built all this expertise. Now I need to not start from scratch, but at least relearn quite a lot. What would I do that? So it's really also trying to get people to see the why and give them a sense of purpose. Right? Your goal is not to build an Android app. Your goal is to help us learn as quickly as possible about our market. And that also, works for other kind of silos. I think one of the things we did over the last 2 years is really go from a team of specialists to having people who are just a lot more generalist and happier to switch from one tech to another or one area to another, to the point that actually we are rewriting this time our mobile app on React Native. So we've got one code base for both Android and iOS. And that means a web developer now can join and say, hey, I know React, so I can write React Native, which we actually found to be true. So working on those different aspects will in at different point in time, basically.
It's a really interesting point. Convince people on the why. I assume is great advice. I can see why that works. How do you manage those conversations as a manager speaking to an IC, right? Do you have a set approach or a go-to on managing or explaining the why insofar as to build trust and take people along the mission with you? Because I suspect as engineering leaders, one of the biggest things is building consensus within teams, right? If you can't take people on that journey with you, if you can't showcase the why, if you can't gather or make alignment within teams, those people, and in this case, Kenneth might have just said, hey, you know what, I don't believe your why, or you didn't necessarily make me see it, so I'm just going to go find a job elsewhere. And you become even more under-resourced. So how do you manage those difficult conversations with people?
So, I think I've managed some of them reasonably well. I failed at many others. So I definitely do not claim to have like a perfect methodology in any way. I think, you said also something interesting, which is, you need to build consensus. Well, actually, I don't believe that. If you can build consensus, that's great. But, sometimes people may think that their role as, a leader is, to be friends with everybody, and that it's all the democracy, and that, everybody should be 100% in agreement with the decision. That is the best way to not make any progress. I believe a lot more in disagree and commit. So you should have conversations about decision. And I can guarantee we had long conversation, for example, about going from full native on iOS and Android to React Native. So you should have this conversation. You should really explain what you're trying to optimize for. I think that's something that is often lost. So if I go back to my example with Kenneth, a software Android engineer, what I was trying to optimize for is I want us to learn faster. So there were two options on the table. Option number one, the iOS app and the Android app are going to be totally different, so that we can learn two things at the same time. Option number two, no, we try to go twice as fast on iOS. So from the very beginning, I phrased it from, this is what I want to optimize for, learning. So now we can talk about options, but at this point, basically, you already frame towards solving a specific problem. So it's it's not about which technology is better, right? Because you could have the conversation about that. You're trying to solve a different problem. So I think it's really trying to come up with those things, trying to be clear about what do you care about, how do you prioritize certain things against each other. If you can get everybody behind you and to be 100% an agreement on the decision, that's great. Quite often you will have some people that are not like totally into it, and that's okay. You need to create a culture where, okay, I've heard you. I think we've talked. Now it's time to take a decision, and we can revisit, right? If we try that thing and that's a disaster, then let's not be attached to our decision. Let's try to understand what are the new facts and go from there. So at least that's kind of how I'm approaching it.
Amazing. I think it's being alongside that journey and watching you kind of put these things into practice was a really interesting growth curve for myself personally. Let's fast forward. 2 years go by, nearly. where are you guys now? What are you working on? And what's the biggest challenge now in comparison to what it was when you first joined?
So, at the company level, we're in a very different place because when I joined, we didn't have a product. We were at a point where we were finishing medical studies, so really kind of finishing R&Ds, and we had just started thinking about what can we do on top of that. Like now that we've established some strong science facts and foundations on science, then how do we build a product on top of that? So that was almost 2 years ago. 2 years later, we've launched a product in the US at the end of last summer, August, and that's going reasonably well. We're quite happy. Customers like it. But in the meantime, we've also launched a COVID Symptom Study. So actually, we've got 2 products, even though we never anticipated doing anything on COVID. So we went from not a product 2 years ago to really what we, our core product in nutrition, which, as I said, is going well. And then another product that has been installed by 4 million people. And this product literally was created in less than a week. So very, very different place and quite a few different challenges. So now we're at a point where, at least on the engineering side, well, the one thing that did not change is we still have too much work to do versus our capacity.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to find better ways to work all together, to prioritize, to really be able to focus. But the engineering team has grown quite a lot. We were 7 or 8 when I joined. We are kind of 25, so it's more structured, which comes with a lot of pros and cons. We can do a lot more things in parallel, but we had quite an aggressive growth. So how do you build this alignment? I think you were mentioning earlier before this podcast. Across 4 different teams, in a world where basically you've hired 70% of your team in COVID and basically in full remote, and we're not a full remote company. So yeah, those are some of the challenge.
I think for me, like if you look at under 2 years as a time frame.
Max, just give me 1 second because I've got an alert for one of our system. No. Just want to make sure everything is not burning. I apologize.
No worries, don't worry. We'll cut and re-edit.
Okay, no, everything is fine. I just need to acknowledge the alert. Oh, and I just got a message to tell me I can have a vaccine. Sorry. Literally, like 30 seconds ago.
This might make its way into the podcast, Julien.
Yes. Anyway, I am back.
Anyways, okay.
So, I don't know for how long, but I'm back.
So there are 2 things that I want to dig into in what you mentioned. The first is an observation, more so, that requires a little bit more context, I think. So my observation is you inherit a team 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, 6, 7 people, a few problems that we've outlined earlier, and you were mainly working on R&D, right? So there wasn't as much variation in products, in different things you had on the go. Less than 2 years later, you've got a team of close to 25 people. You've spun up the COVID Symptom Study, which got to 4 million users in record time. So, there's a lot of companies out there who are trying to get their core product to half that level of traction, right? And that would be a success for them. And you kind of had that happen accidentally through the work that you were doing. But at the same time, you're launching the product in the States, you've grown the team. A lot of people listening to this, as engineering leaders, founders, product people, would be interested to know how you can take a company that does that and or a function that was capable of, where it was when you joined to where it is today. So the question I want to kind of give back to you is, what are some of the principles you've tried to instill and optimize for with your team in order to get them to make such a huge transformation in being able to cope with various different products, with being able to, work with moving requirements and shifting goalposts and have so many different things on the go. So how, in your view, what were the processes or the structures or the mindset changes that you had to instill along the way to get to this point?
So, the first part is that you make it look awesome, but in practice, we're making it up as we go. I think that is the truth. Like, it's easy to say, oh, you've got a grand plan for whatever, and you know exactly which are the next steps and whatnot. Not at all. I think it's a lot of just baby steps. Let's try to fix, one thing, and by the time you fix one thing, something else will break. So actually, also back to an initial question you've asked, which is, what are the kind of the challenge for someone like me? One of the challenges, you had a really good understanding on how to do your job before, and now you really have this also sense of urgency where you just need to do so many different things because you just don't have enough skills in your team. So, even if you've got great people, that's just, 22 things you need to do to know how to do very well. And actually, you've got the skills only for whatever, 15. So a lot of what you do is also just, closing the gap and say, okay, I should not be doing that thing, but I'm going to do that thing just because I can help. And then I can try to teach the little I know to someone else to get them to perform well. But how did we do it? Same thing, no recipes. And, I think we're in a good place today, but also have, tons of regrets of things that we could have done better. But, we tried as much as possible to, get people to feel responsible. And I think that's really something that is easier to do in a startup because, it's just a smaller environment. So you understand a lot better what kind of impact you can have. Quite a lot, most people just take that and run with it. Some a lot less, and that's actually an issue in a startup environment. You really want people to take ownership and make things happen, and as much as possible not micromanage anything. And I guess one principle I'm always trying to push for, again, sometimes with successes, sometimes with less, is really try to focus on the essence. It's really easy to get lost, and let's make that thing 10% better. And you're like, actually, that making that thing 10% better is not what's going to make us succeed or fail as a business. In the grand scheme of things, yes, you're right. If we had unlimited resources, we should do it. But is it really the most important thing you can do this week? And in many ways, I'm also, for example, pushing in software engineers to think about that in terms of technical debt, which is, you want to refactor that piece of code. Great, you should tackle technical debt, but are you sure this piece of code, spending the next 2 hours on this piece of code is the best investment you can make in terms of solving technical debt? Is there something else somewhere where if you do spend those 2 hours, it's actually going to have a lot more impact? So always trying to go back to that. Like we've got very limited resources. Let's try to be a bit deliberate about where we spend our time. And again, that's very hard because you pull in so many directions. So it's very aspirational. In practice, we are sometimes fail miserably at doing that.
Do you think building up tech debt as you build new features and services is okay for a startup? And if so, at what point do you need to start to consider going back to fix some of those things?
So it's totally okay to build tech debt. I think one important thing to realize is if you do have some tech debt, down the line, that probably means that you've got a product that someone cares about, which is great. Because if not, then just delete the whole code base, right? No one cares. No one is using your product. So I think that's, I really like elegant software, and I've got very strong opinion on how to build that. But at the same time, you need to recognize that the goal is not to have the perfect system in terms of software architecture. The goal is to build a product that people love and use and are ready to pay for. And you need good software architecture to achieve that in the long term, but it's also perfectly fine to sometimes take just massive shortcuts. What is really, really hard, though, is to indeed know where it's time to switch to something else. One of my mentor, Dan North, talked about the idea of spike and stabilize. It's perfectly fine to spike something and forget about your unit test, and it's just ugly and it doesn't scale, but you can ship it very, very quickly to some customers or some people to get some kind of feedback. If they don't like it, just delete it, start again, next ID. If they do like it, now is the time to start thinking about how do you stabilize that thing. And the transition is hard. It's hard to know when to do it. I'd say more often than not, we probably do it a bit too late, but I would certainly rather do it a bit too late than a bit too soon, because at the end of the day, it's all about cycle time. So now the real question becomes, how do you do that sustainably? How do you make sure that your cycle time is just, keep going faster and faster and faster, even though you are creating a lot of kind of small experiment like that? And that's where you need to also have a constant streams of investing in your capabilities. And the way I think about it is it's perfectly fine to create, tons of experiments are quite crappy, but you want to constantly improve your general tooling and platform so that actually building the next experiment becomes a bit easier, a bit more standard. Because investing in those is never wasted. Even if that doesn't work out on this experiment, you will be able to reuse it on the next one, on the next one, and the next one. Whereas making, the specific piece of code perfect, but having nothing reusable, could lead to a lot of waste if no one cares about that part of the product. So that's how I think about it.
I think your approach to it will give a lot of people comfort, right? It's okay to take baby steps. You didn't have all of this planned out or structured, and you learn along the way. You pick things that have a big impact in the grand scheme of things, and not just focus on tiny optimizations along the way, 10% increases here and there and marginal gains. It's okay to, at times, given your trade-offs, build up tech debt and address it at a later point. And I think I want to actually go back and talk about at the height of the pandemic, before the COVID Symptom Study launched, and this was around the time you were prototyping building this alongside a couple of engineers. COVID was killing over 1,000 people a day at this point, and it was at the very height of it. And I think, what you're saying in terms of considering your trade-offs, thinking about technical debt, writing tests, and making something scalable. When you create a product like that is aimed to directly tackle something that's taking lives, and you literally, in every sense of the word, don't have the time to build an application in best practices, right? So when you had to build this, there's actually a few things I wanted to explore. What was your role in the first version of that app being launched? What was the lead up in the story of how it got to the point it got to? And later on, I kind of want to talk about other engineering leaders and how close they are to engineering and being hands-on, and how far away some of them can be, and what, in your view, is a good balance, if there is one. So talk me through, let's take you back to early 2020, and those first few months when the COVID was killing a lot of people. What was that journey for you?
Yeah, so I think at the time we built the COVID Symptom Study up, there was probably actually a bit less death than that, but literally we started thinking about it, I think 3 days, maybe not, no, I'm sorry, I'm incorrect. I think we started talking about it 3 days after the beginning of the lockdown or something like that. So, the UK is just entering lockdown for the first time. And now we're 18 months later, we're sadly used to the notion, but at the time it's totally new, and everybody is depressed. Actually, I remember, we were not in lockdown and already, but we at ZOE, we just had anticipated by literally just a few days and decided to start working from home. So we're in this kind of just transition period, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. But I think at this point, everybody was depressed in one way or another. Certainly I was. This is not good. We don't know how long it's gonna last. Some people are a lot more optimistic than others. I remember I was not in a very optimistic mood at the time. And therefore, I think one question we're asking ourselves is, what can we do about it? And we at ZOE were in a place where we're lucky to have kind of the right set of skill, totally by accident, to actually do something about it. So it's funny because I remember the conversation going in parallel with two of my co-founders, Jonathan and Tim Spector. And Tim is actually working at KCL on all the science that is powering the ZOE product. So he's kind of has one foot in industry and one foot in education and research. So they were started to talk about, hey, could we do something, because KCL was basically going into shutdown, and all the research that we used to do at the point could not continue going just because people had to work from home, right? And in the same time, I was pinging my boss Jonathan and say, hey, there is this great thing happening in France. Maybe we could do something about COVID too. And anyway, 24 hours later, it was kind of ideas converge, and Jonathan get back to me and say, hey, I talked to Tim, and I think that it would be super useful to gather some data on COVID and build that app, and build an app to basically power that. And that's very similar to some of the stuff we've been doing in the past. And me, I was yeah, great, let's do it. But back to your point, I think we had a wonderful forcing constraint in some way, which is this absolute sense of urgency. And we really decided to run that as a hackathon in terms of mindset. So, I started the day at a stand-up and told my people, there were 8 of us, you know what, guys, let's try to build an app. It's totally optional. You don't have to work on that. This is if you feel like it. If you feel like it, this is everything you're going to do for the next 48 hours. But also be conscious that, the way I'm planning to run that is also really hackathon style, in the sense I'm pretty sure I'm not going to sleep that much in the next 48 hours, because I personally really want to try to get something out in that time frame. But it was kind of really really crazy, and not how we work normally. But for me, my role, I decided to go as deep as I could on that. As in, I don't want to be there just tell people to sleep late and write code. I am going to write code. I'm going to do everything in my power to just ship the thing. And I don't care what is my job title. I don't care if I've got expertise or not. I just want to make it happen. Anyway, long story short, there were 6 of us working on the very first version of this app. 4 software engineer, one designer, and Jonathan, actually my boss, also looking at all the legal aspects, which are very challenging actually. And yeah, I ended up writing 50% of the mobile app with another software engineer over the next few days, which was terrible if you think about it in many aspects, because next week we'll launch 36 hours, we've got a lot of users, and then I'm 100% the key man risk at this point, because what we launched was really not great. So there was tons of things we needed to do, and at this point you're supposed to take a step back and do stuff to help others step in. But back to my point about startup life, like there is such a sense of urgency that actually one of the most important things you can do at this point is actually continue to ship features for 2 weeks as quickly as you can, because that is what is relieving the pressure. So I try to balance the two, basically still help on the code base, and trying to extract myself as quickly as I could and get others to step in and take over. But yeah, it's hard, and we probably didn't do it that well in the end, but no regret on that side.
Despite yourself deprecating the kind of nature around the build, did the users care? The people downloading the app in mass, right? Did they care about the fact that the app in its infancy wasn't built in the way that would be considered as good practice in engineering? Did you get a lot of that feedback from them? Or?
So, obviously, absolutely not, because most people had absolutely no idea how to build, software right. So it's just not something that anyone would think about. Then people had no idea that it wasn't built right in the first place. I mean, they can see the visible face, right? But they don't know how it is under the hood. Whereas all of us were like, oh my God, that's the absolute definitions of technical debt. Like just everything has been assembled with tape all over the place. The only thing we didn't do is take shortcuts on security, interestingly. But no, people do not care. I think something that's been extremely interesting for me, which will be probably very obvious for a lot of people, certainly wasn't at all for me at the time, is that when we launch, our UI was really terrible. Like it just felt clunky. And Elena, that was working on design with us, she never told me, but I'm sure she was hating me at the time, because she made those wonderful design with rounded corner and whatnot, and I was just like, no time, just drop the basic components and move on to the next screen, and we'll revisit. So we had this wonderful design, and then what we actually ended up shipping was just horrible. So I thought that most people would complain about that and those kind of things and UX in general. It turns out that at the very beginning, what really killed us was the sheer amount of people that wanted to reset that password and could not, because we had not built reset password feature. The number of people that just dropped reviews was kind of absolutely insane about that. Well, I've lost my password and blah, blah, blah. And, I'm sure I'd put that password, but it's not working. 99% of the case, actually, they just entered a different password or, had uppercase or something like that. So, yeah, we had just tons of people asking for that. I think it was the first feature we've built after we launched was actually reset password. Right. And when you think about it, I would not have bet any amount of money on that, maybe wrongly, but for me, you install the app, you log in, you're logged in, right? That's it, done. You don't need to reset your password. Well, a lot of people do somehow, and we probably had some technical problems where some people were logged out, also because again the app was not great, but very naive me, 90% of the people are using the same password everywhere. Well, not in that case, or at least, at least it didn't appear so. So it was really interesting to learn that, all your great plans about what matters and what doesn't, when they're confronted with reality, you get just very different feedback from people about what they care about or not.
It's fascinating because it's something I've been thinking about personally, and we work with a lot of product companies, B2C, direct to consumer, and it's a question that keeps coming back to me. Users are forgiving. Users don't have the engineering goggles on. They don't look at things or a lack of features, or maybe there are certain things overarching that are big that are like, okay, it'd be great to be able to do this, like in the case of a password reset. But for the most part, I think I don't know if you agree with this, but there's a trend happening where the focus around kind of quality software sometimes gets in the way of people being able to build things fast, challenge their ideas with the market. And I think people think a little bit maybe too much about what the user feedback is going to be, when oftentimes users are very forgiving. They don't have the same level of understanding of what's being built under the hood that the engineer would, right? Which is interesting, and I think it reflects it in your experience. The thing that I want to kind of close off with is, and it's perhaps a big one, and maybe we'll have another session and book in another podcast to dive into this in a little bit more detail, because as I say, I think there's hours and hours of content for us to talk through. But you built the COVID Symptom Study in under lockdown with a remote team. Since then, the company has embraced the remote first culture, so much so that I think ZOE are pushing the boundaries of remote work, at least in my understanding, to a lot of other startups in London. It's a really interesting topic right now, where direct-to-consumer companies that have cross-functional teams, and they feel like, the old school Kanban boards and having PMs with engineers and designers in one space is great. And there's ZOE doing something completely unique and different. And over the last 6 months, you've actually yourself hired engineers that are globally distributed in different time zones, in different countries. And in my understanding, that is going to be the case going forward. What has been your experience doing that? Your thought process around going fully remote, around having a globally distributed engineering team? What have been some of the ups and downs? And in your view, what do you think the future of the workplace might look like? Is it closer to what you are doing, or is there, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a very long topic to cover. The first point I want to make is that this is a perfect example of, if you really focus on something, and if you've got forcing constraint, you can make things happen extremely quickly. Because in practice, almost all the business in the UK, at least all the one with knowledge worker, overnight became remote. So with kind of various degrees of success, but the way you would think about it in normal time is, we're going to think about it for the next 18 months, and then maybe we'll start doing something. So it's really interesting to see just, when you have this kind of very strong deadline in front of you, that suddenly you can remove a lot of bureaucracy and just make a lot of things happen very, very fast. And I think that's, we need to challenge ourselves daily to do more of that. But in many ways, we were lucky at ZOE, because we had a few people that believed that it was possible to have a remote-only company working well. Like this is not something that everybody will agree with, but for example, before that, I had never been a remote worker, but my core belief is that you could build a very successful company remotely, or a very successful company, full on-site. The two are absolutely possible, and And other people in the company thought, for example, that being full remote was just going to be no matter what a disaster before COVID. So I was a lot more open to know there is a path because GitLab did it and plenty of other companies. So I was curious about it, and a few other people were curious about it. So when we moved to it, that really helped us because we knew where to look for best practice, and then we just massively copy pasted all of it. Like, those people are doing that. They've been doing it for 10 years. We have no idea what we're doing. Let's start from from what they're doing as a baseline. We probably did not do all of it, but at least some of it. So trying to be more synchronous is one example. Just writing down a lot more stuff, making sure that people turn the video on. Which interestingly, there's competing studies about that, but basically we copy-pasted all of it. And for us, that worked very well. And I actually think we're very lucky because at this point, ZOE was already distributed across 2 offices, one in Boston, one in London. And we had this strong barrier, this strong frontier between these 2 offices. It was, in many ways, 2 different companies, with the headquarters being in London, and then people in the US feeling a bit disconnected. Overnight, that changed. Everybody on the same level. And for me, that was a great force experiment on us. And there's been a lot of change in perception in the company about remote and the fact that it can work, to the point that, as you said, we're embarking on this journey where we're adopting what we call internally the fully flexible model. We want to give people the choice to either come to an office in certain cities, at least at the beginning, Boston or London, whenever they want. Don't have to come 5 days a week. They could come an hour per week if they want. They could come 3 days a week. And we want to combine that with having people that are full remote. So this is how we see the world going forward. It's really kind of giving the freedom to people to do whatever they want, which comes with what I will call still remote first culture, in the sense. The one thing we don't want is reestablish like a very strong base in either London or Boston, to the point that, if you don't come to the office, you don't have access to information, or you can have some issues with career progressions or things like that. So we want, for example, we're saying that you can go to the office, but every single one of your meeting, this is going to be, you in front of a computer on Zoom or Google Meet. Even if there's like 5 of you in that call, and 2 of you are in the office together, you don't share your screen. Each one of you in front of your screen, as if you were at home, so that everybody is really at the same level. So we're not inventing anything here. It's basically what those companies have been saying you should do, and we're trying to get inspiration from them, basically.
Wow.
But I think to conclude, I mean, my view of the world is that more and more companies, certainly in the startup space, are going to adopt this model. We want to, we're not like super early adopters like companies that I mentioned, such as GitLab, but I have a strong belief that this is the future. I have a strong belief that people need human connection. Which is why we want to have this also fully flexible model. I think different people will react differently to it. But at the end of the day, I also strongly believe that what we've experienced in the last year, this forceful remote, is not the full flavored version of it.
Right.
Because it was full remote, where I can go out, I can't see my friends, I can't go to a restaurant, I can't do any of that. So it is super isolating. And I think hopefully with COVID kind of becoming a bit of things in the past, at least in this country, we will be able to have some of the full remote benefits, such as flexibility around working hours, working from wherever you want, etc. But reintroduce all the social elements that is absolutely required for human beings, both at a very personal level. Like I can go out and have a beer with friends or neighbors or my rugby team, but also at the company level. Let's all go together at restaurant or do a workshop or etc. Like let's get everybody to come and for 2 days at the office or something like that. I think for me, combining the two is really exciting, and I believe in that. And certainly at a very personal level, I cannot imagine myself going back 5 days a week to the office. That's just no go. I learned too many good things, and then I'm spending more time with family, with kids. I reorganize my day in a very different way. That it would just be such a downer to spend an hour 30 minutes per day commuting, and I'm one of the lucky one. Like it's not 2 hours or 3 hours.
That's amazing. We, as you mentioned, we could probably talk about this in hours for pushbacks and different things. So maybe I'll schedule something in further down the line to talk specifically around this for the next 30 minutes. Wanted to close it off with one bit of advice you would give to either aspiring engineering leaders, people going from the IC into their first management role, or somebody who's about to start a new role as a VP or a director in a startup, and they're going into it with a level of anxiety and, similar to what you were going into a domain or a space which you kind of had thoughts and ideas about, but you confronted them when you landed. What would that advice be?
There's so many advice that could be given. It's so easy to give advice, but so hard to apply them. I think one trap, I think, is you come from a place, you knew everything about it, and you're probably quite good at your job, and you just want to make your new place or your new role to be the same, and you apply the same recipes. I actually believe that a lot of leading people, managing people, two things are a bit different. It's very, very contextual. And it's just very easy to fall into the trap that this process worked for us. Let's literally copy paste it. Wonderful. Let's make it, and then it's going to work. And actually, no, because you probably arrive at that process that worked very well, through a very long path. You had a lot of learning, and people learn along with you. If you take it and just apply it on your new place, then people will not have that understanding, so they will have massive resistance. Or like, what? That doesn't make any sense. I don't even see the problem you're trying to solve. So why are you changing all that stuff? So always trying to get people to adhere to what you're building and not be dogmatic about what great look like. But at the same time, that's really hard. Like that's a challenge for me every day. Not accepting whatever currently exists as the new normal, and constantly challenging the status quo and saying, being able to go back to his past experience and say, no, this was really better. So how do I go towards that? So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. Balance to be found between those two things.
Julien, it's been a pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. I will link into the bio section a place for people to be able to find you, to follow you. You've been around the circuit, you've done some speaking gigs, you've been on a few podcasts, so there might be other things out there for people to follow you. So I'll link those descriptions below. And I wanted to sign off by saying thank you for participating in the very first episode. So I'm really excited to launch this out and hopefully provide the value that I've gained over the years to people watching this. So please do subscribe, like, download, and if you have any feedback, let us know. Thank you.
Well, Max, thank you very much for inviting me and for hearing me say all the things.